They're quite the congregation, from places as far and wide as you can imagine. Doubtless they'd have all come to blows at first glance, were it not for the charm kindly Mikola put upon us. This is what allows us to serve together, the work of a living God.
And now, our feature presentation.
Alright, welcome back to the Honored Madman Show. Today we're going to be talking about the various NPCs of the Shadow Realm from Elden Ring's newest DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree. And like many From Software games, this is certainly an oddball bunch of characters who are all pretty interesting in their own right. So let's start with Mikola's undaunted group of outcasts, the Band of Mike. And each member had been individually charmed by Mikola himself prior to the events of the DLC. And after his supposed disappearance, these individuals would like to know where he went and why he went there. Each one has their own reasons and motivations and personality, but it isn't quite clear at first when you meet them because they're all still under the effect of Mikola's spell. And they aren't free to this until Mike drops his great rune about a third of the way through the DLC's story progression. There's a handful of other NPCs who aren't affiliated with this group as well that we'll get into, but we're going to cover the Band of the Mike first. So first off, there's Leda or Leda. I think I prefer the Leda pronunciation, but she was once an Oathseeker Knight. And Oathseeker Knights are essentially individuals who strove to find some kind of cause or purpose or person to essentially serve in a lifelong perfect service, if you will. I believe Leda is tarnished, as it was said she had a faded gold hue in her eyes when Mikola found her and gave her purpose, basically bewitching her like he does to everybody who serves him, but also recoloring her tarnished eyes with his freaky deaky magic, essentially untarnishing her in the process. This would of course foster a sort of toxic level of devotion to Mikola deep within Leda. And by that I mean she became a total paranoid lunatic. Literally, she slaughtered the other Oathseeker Knights or the other Needle Knights. It isn't quite clear which of her groups of knightly comrades she slaughtered. She perceives threats to her chosen lord everywhere and is definitely not afraid to act on them. Her goal, as she puts it, is simply to remove or eradicate all doubt in the world in Mikola. I think this is what we can come to expect from a Age of Compassion if it were to ever play out. It's not too different from the Age of the Erdtree. Anything in opposition to the current god's will is forcibly suppressed until it's forgotten about or becomes known as a curse. But yeah, I think some would say that Leda is too loyal to Mikola's cause to the point where it even maybe diminishes it as a whole with her actions. While at first she seems like this kindly matron leader of this band of outcasts and misfits, wearing her onyx and gold black armor covered with a white cloak. This of course is meant to hide her dark nature. She completely assumes a noble appearance, whereas someone say like Ansbach, the dark, shady looking member of the group, is actually the most trustful. Now Leda is able to keep her true self under wraps, at least while Mikola's blessing is still active, but once the formerly slumbering Empyrean discards his great rune, the enchantment on Leda's band was broken. And it's at this point where she begins thinking which of her group members is not completely loyal to the cause. She first deduces Hornsent, which is understandable given the character's hatred for America and all things Erdtree related. She basically says like, someone like him could never be trusted to truly be on our side. Dude's got way too much baggage. And she's not wrong, even if you help this guy out, he does eventually betray you in the end. Her suspicions are ultimately totally justified here. She later expresses similar sentiments about Ansbach's loyalty, and again she's ultimately proven right as he never really did forget his blood pact with Mog. But she seems to have two motives behind wanting Ansbach removed, and the other one seems to be that she fears him. She knows what a great detective he is, and if she really knows about what Mikola's doing with Mog's remains, she'd have every reason to suspect him turning on the group. And knowing how respected he is, this could also lead to other members of the group defecting along with him, and that's a whole other problem that Leda doesn't want to have to deal with. She also sort of has a bit of a bias against Ansbach, and that makes sense too because Ansbach is the one who gave Mikola his other title, the Wounded, in that duel he had with him. So he quite literally cut her master, her god. It's not hard to see why she wouldn't eventually look for an excuse to have him removed. And like I said, for what it's worth, she was right. Once Mikola's enchantment expires, Ansbach is immediately reminded of his blood oath to Mog, and upon learning what Mikola did with his master's remains, he's fully willing to stand against the mighty demigod once again. So her suspicions did prove correct. He was ultimately going to be a threat in the long run. I just think it's funny how she dismisses Thialier, saying, he's not really going to be a threat, he serves Saint Trina. And we see how that plays out in the end, don't we? And while she's asking us to assist her in the removal of various members of her group, we have to remember one important thing. This woman killed her previous companions, the other members of her knightly order. They were all slaughtered by her hand. And no matter how much she cleans that sword of hers, the stench of the crusted blood of her comrades will never leave its blade. Sort of a constant reminder at the lengths she's willing to go to prove her loyalty in what the Oathseeker Knights would call a perfect devotion. The best part about Leda is when Mikola's enchantment finally breaks and she almost instantly declares that she's not so sure about the others and that maybe it'd be best if she culled the ones that she's decided are undeserving of Mikola's love, and she's so impressed with herself, saying why didn't I think of this sooner, It's just funny how this is like a major revelation to her, as she was unable to think about this due to Mikola's enchantment. And so it seems to me that the enchantment was mainly just to keep Leda from killing the others, since she's so predisposed to just straight up offing her comrades based on extremely vague justifications. I mean, she's definitely the extreme side of what an age of compassion might look like, and who would have thought that forced affection would have bad side effects? And another thing to remember is that there's no real way to truly side with Leda. I mean, we can help her against Hornsent and Ansbach, but even then, once we encounter her at Erdtree, she's pretty much made up her mind about us being a threat to Mikola as well, so there's really no reason to side with her except for, getting Ansbach's bow. Leda does eventually realize how mistrustful she is of others when she's not enchanted by Mikola, but that's only after deciding to kill 2 more of her comrades, and it doesn't stop her from ambushing us in Erdtree. But it is worth noting that she's technically right on all 3 accounts.
We could have been a good couple. We could have had something special. But you one crazy ass bitch.
Next up, we've got the man who cut God himself, Sir Ansbach, the wise pureblood knight commander, who was simultaneously well-liked, widely respected, and deeply feared by his comrades and enemies alike. In many ways, he's sort of like a better version of Sir Gideon Ofnir, another individual who was absolutely terrified of the power of a god. However, unlike Gideon, Ansbach didn't let his fear cripple him, and once the enchantment was broken, he didn't choose to serve a terrifying god that he feared. No, Gideon at the end remained a pawn for America, and Ansbach reclaimed himself at the end and chose to fight against God once more in the name of the dignity of his fallen lord. The two just simply aren't comparable. Named after a town in Germany, this character is probably the coolest out of all the new NPCs introduced in this DLC, in my humble opinion. I went over a lot of his background already in a separate video about him and Mog, but I still managed to miss a few things. So first of all, Sir Ansbach was in Mog's service for a long time. I mean, he may have been as old as the Pureblood Order itself. He's a seasoned combat veteran who's knocked off numerous foes, and by the time we meet him, he's every bit as weathered as the Pureblood Knight's medal he wears to fasten his cloak. It's said that when Mog quote-unquote kidnapped Mikola and returned to the Dynasty Mausoleum, Ansbach detected that his lord had been bewitched or enchanted, and seeing the twisted, bizarre fuckery that was at play here, Ansbach was understandably outraged and challenged Mikola to a duel. And this pureblood knight was so tremendously skilled and talented that he actually managed to cleave open the most fearsome Empyrean in the world before he had his heart stolen by him. And unfortunately for Ansbach, this enchantment would last for a very long time, up until the very point where Mikola discarded his great rune. Before that point, Ansbach had his own suspicions of serving Mikola in the Shadow Realm. I mean, he wanted to know what the demigod was up to there. He can't quite put his finger on it, but he knows something isn't quite right, and it isn't until the spell is broken that he's able to remember his blood pact to Mog and the life-altering side effects of his duel with Mikola. And naturally, all this does is reinvigorate his determination to find out what exactly Mikola is doing with Mog's corpse, because as he notes later on, after the Lord of Blood's untimely demise, someone made off with his remains. And once he makes it to the Shadow Tower, with the help of the player, he's able to uncover the truth about what's going to happen to Mog's corpse. He's going to be used as a vessel, basically a box to stuff Radahn's soul into, and form to fit, so that Radahn can be Miquella's new consort, and they can usher in this age of supposed compassion. Forced compassion, mind you, and we've seen the extreme side of that spectrum and what can come from it with Leda, so don't go and think that Miquella was the best possible option, because we really don't know. It's just as foreign and unknowable as Ranni's ending. Anyway, though, Ansbach is the man. Once he learns the truth, he's fully ready for his rematch with a god. Regardless if it's technically two gods this time, one of them being the supposedly strongest demigod now in the body of his former master. None of that matters. Ansbach's ready to fight, and fight to the death he shall. And I think Ansbach is so respected because, aside from being an expert in the arts of killing, this wizened knight conducts himself like a true gentleman. He has what some would say a refined aggression about him. He's also just an all-around helpful comrade and friend. I mean, he feels compelled to assist Freya in her search for answers in the Shadow Keep, knowing full well that it will likely lead to them ending up on the opposite sides of each other's blades. Even in his fight with Radahn, he greets him and tells him it's nice to see him, but that body, it isn't yours, and that Mog, my master Mog, he's gonna have his dignity back, that's for goddamn sure. I don't know about you guys, but for me it really dials up the atmosphere of that fight, this gentlemanly exchange. And the fact that Radahn doesn't reply leads me to believe that he isn't all there, that the resurrection was not perfect, but that's a story for another video. Anyway, Ansbach was an extremely human character, which itself was a bit of an anomaly given the crowd he liked to roll with. But this is a guy who has lived a lifetime of slaughter in honorable service to a demigod, and now he knows that his prime years are long past him, and he's filled with self-doubt about his ability to avenge his lord, but he presses on proudly. He knows that the pursuit of his quest will likely be the death of him, but he probably sees dying in the act of avenging Mog as a sort of redemption for being unable to stop Miquella from bewitching his master in the first place, and not to mention stealing his remains after he was killed. And the best part is it's not like Ansbach is doing this under any sort of pressure from a higher power. I mean, his master and demigod are dead. He's avenging Mog so he can die at peace with redemption and no regrets in his heart. It's the one thing he could do to make up his failure. This is something he set for himself. It's just an important note about Ansbach is he's not merely a pawn. He just was an extremely loyal dude who wanted to avenge his lord. But as I probably already mentioned, Ansbach may be old, but he was still a feared combatant. His weapons of choice were the bow and scythe. However, he had a secret technique he had developed all his own, an incantation born of a savage desperation that gave way to his fearsome reputation. It's honestly really cool. I just wish it got buffed a bit in one of these patches for how much work it is to get. I mean, you literally have to kill Radahn, consort of Miquella, to get this incantation, and it's not even really that powerful. But its description makes it seem like it should do a lot more damage than it does, so maybe they need to fix that. Who knows?
The cascading sheets of blood. He cannot be left to fester.
Next up, we've got our lovably pathetic poisoner, Thialie.
Any man who calls a poison a woman's weapon is a traitor to his fellow men. Poison is the thought that wakes you in the morning and lulls you to sleep at night.
Presumably named after this genus of flowers, Thialie is a bit of a pitiable individual. He's a master alchemist and poisoner, but all he really wants is a good night's sleep. I mean, maybe a sleep that he's not able to wake up from, but a long night's sleep nonetheless. A good sleep, in hopes of seeing Saint Trina once again. See, he was once granted the sweet nectary repose of a velvety sleep from Saint Trina. Just only once. And let's just say he's been chasing that high ever since. He's been coming up with various poison concoctions to put himself to sleep, even stuff strong enough to put to sleep even the most ancient of dragons, but still the purple velvety sleep of Saint Trina has evaded him. And that's led to him becoming a bit depressed by the time we meet him. He's got Sir Moore and his forager brood out looking for a substance known as black syrup, in hopes of finally creating a concoction that will grant him another audience with Saint Trina and that sweet, sweet nectary sleep. The concoction, however, isn't strong enough, and he sort of resigns himself to his old, depressed, broody mood. That is until we discover and tell him about the great fissure found in the Cerulean coast. The one full of the giant coffins and the purple lilies. This fills Thialier with determination, and he presumably takes a leap into the chasm. So Thialier is able to assist us with the Putrescent Knight boss fight, but afterwards he kind of turns into a jealous little bitch. First he tells us not to imbibe St. Trina's nectar because she must speak to him and him alone, and she's his god. But what's he gonna do to stop us? So of course we imbibe the nectar a few times, and eventually we manage to actually hear the voice of St. Trina before he does. And after learning this, he becomes a bit unhinged with a jealous rage and invades us in the Putrescent Knight's boss arena. This probably goes without saying, but it's not a hard fight. So after he's been dealt with, he returns to his normal pitiful demeanor, begging St. Trina to speak with him, and it appears his wish is eventually granted as he shows up to assist the player and Ansbach against Lita and her goons. And afterwards, he's even willing to go against Mikola himself, so I can only assume that Thialier eventually heard the same final will and testament of St. Trina that we heard, kill Mikola. I also really like that out of everybody else in the group, Lita never specifically viewed Thialier as a threat because of, how could he turn on Mikola if he was fanatically devoted to Mikola's other half, St. Trina, regardless of her being the discarded half, claiming that St. Trina's love for Mikola was boundless, and this turned out to be extremely short-sighted as it was precisely St. Trina's love for Mikola that led to her commanding both Thialier and the player to, in fact, kill him. Anyway, for all of his many faults, Thialier rises to the occasion to face the most fearsome Empyrean alongside the strongest demigod. Now this fanatical poisoner's weapon of choice was a hidden needle and poisoned perfume bottles, and he might not look like much, but he's surprisingly brave, and he was skilled enough to earn praise from the legendary Ansbach, so that has to count for something. Thialier was at times jealous, sad, self-pitying, weak, and whiny, but you know what? He comes through for us in the end, and really that's all that matters. The next one on this list has already been rather poorly received by the community as a whole, probably because of the attitude and the overall way he talks to the player.
Almost with a qualitative fucking anger to it. I don't find exact fucking words for it, but it fucking disturbs and concerns me.
Now I'm of course referring to the Hornsent NPC, perhaps the most out-of-place member of the Band of Mike. He's a surviving member of the antique race of hornfolk known as the Hornsent, and he's not just any Hornsent. This guy was a potentate of Bonnie Village, a place now famous for the horrors that were committed there against Newman and other humans by these Hornsent potentates. So for some background, a long time ago, America betrayed the Hornsent people in some way, presumably stealing divinity from their god or perhaps killing their god. And after she discovered what the Hornsent were doing to her people, the Newman, she ordered her twisted son Mesmer to carry out a purge of the horned folk, their deities and the divine beasts included. And so they were purged, but it didn't stop there. They were also burned and impaled, put on display for all to see. The historians say it was as if it was a giant funeral pyre for the Hornsent people as a whole. And many would say the Hornsent had this coming for what they did to the Newman and the Shaman, but I think there's a little more nuance to it than all that. I really didn't expect this guy to become so hated so fast, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised. I liked him though, but he has a terribly bad attitude, talks shit to us right away, and claims we are unworthy, and then he straight up betrays us after we help him get his revenge no matter what ending we did in the base game, which is sorta in line with what he says to us in our last dialogue with him, but he's a prick, but it all makes his hatred of America and the Erdtree feel more realistic. There's no way this guy will ever like us. We're tarnished. We can't really be friends with this guy. Sure, we could be situational allies, but that's about it. We can't help his people, and we happen to be of the very same people who killed his own kinsmen, including his family too, which is pretty fucked up. So I'm really not surprised that we never become friends with this dude. And now a lot of people say, like I said earlier, that he and the Hornsent had it coming, since they were chopping up Shaman, Newman, and humans with rotten tooth whips and oversized knives and stuffing them into jars, an atrocity he most certainly took part in based on his mask. Many would say he's a war crim, and yeah, he sure is, but there's a couple things we should take into consideration first. So first off, the Hornsent potentates are born into this tradition. It's not their fault that the tradition involves kidnapping and rounding up members of other races for the sole purpose of butchering them and stuffing them into jars. These guys are just carrying on the cultural identity of their village. And according to the Greater Potentates cookbook, a handful of these individuals were actually haunted by the traditions of their hometown. And secondly, we don't really know if the shaman being rounded up and jarred happened before America's betrayal or afterwards as a response to it. Sure, we know that Marika likely sicked Mesmer on them only after she discovered her abandoned home village, but we don't really know who started this whole cycle of retribution. The wheel kinda just goes ever on. I will say, though, that the Hornsense dialogue in the Mesmer fight really adds to the atmosphere. I mean, maybe not as much as Aigon's or Ansbach's, but it's solid nonetheless, and after Mesmer's death, the Hornsent becomes prone to flights of fancy, delusions really, claiming that he'll kill every last one of Marika's line and the Erdtree faithful, ranting and raving like a maniac or like a shonen villain, frothing at the mouth, if you will. So he essentially gives himself over to his indulgences and loses what was left of his sanity in the process after getting his revenge. Turns out maybe he would be better off if he wasn't allowed to achieve his dream of killing Mesmer. I mean, maybe we should just give this one to Leda. She was totally spot on in her reasoning to remove him. Getting his revenge totally does make him give in to madness and his desire to kill Marika's lineage, which still includes Mikola. Regardless if he divested himself of it all, the lineage still remains, and that would make him a target to this vengeance-seeking Hornsent. And even if you do help him against Leda, he's still a little bitch about it. All he can say is, "Oh, I didn't ask for your help. I never asked for any assistance." And it's like, well, you would die without my help. So, I totally get why he isn't the most well-received character in this DLC, but he's got a couple cool moments. One thing I really like about the Hornsent is that Leda mentions that he could always smell the killer on her, the scent of crusted blood on her blade, so he never really fully trusted her anyway, which of course is why she asked for our help in icing him. But I just thought that was interesting. He's the only one to see through Leda's kindly exterior and notice the killer within.
Certain facts show in the muck.
Anyway though, the Hornsent, he's a controversial guy, but I like both outcomes of his quest, and his weapon of choice is this interesting pair of curved swords called the Falx. Very, very fun to use. I haven't actually got to fully test them out yet, but the little bit I have used is a lot of fun. Now moving on to Freya, named after the Norse goddess of Vanaheim, I believe. Freya was a gladiator, a famous one at the various colosseums in the lands between before they were all shut down. The demigod Radon would often watch her bouts in his youth, and he soon became her #1 fan. He was so impressed by her fighting abilities that after his dad Radagon shut down all the arenas, Radon offered Freya a job, an opportunity to serve him as a Redmane Knight, and serve him she did. She was on the front lines when Malenia and her Cleanrot Knights descended upon Caelid, a battle that would leave the wilds looking like an Ozzy Osbourne album cover. Freya fought valiantly here, slaughtering countless foes with that fancy sword of hers, but in the process received a face full of scarlet rot for her trouble, afflicting her quite thoroughly. I mean, it was right in her face. You can still see the puncture wound on her mask. However, it was said that she was found by Mikola, or was brought to him, who healed her festering wound, keeping her from death, but enchanting her in the process by putting a light in her wound that would soon become her compass. This would eventually guide her to Leda and the others, all enchanted by Mikola, who wished to follow the Empyrean into the Shadow Realm. Outside of her unknowing bewitchment, Freya harbored her own reasons for undertaking this journey in the first place, but it would remain obscure to her until Mikola broke his great rune, freeing her and the other members of the Band of Mike from their enchantment. Now with her memories no longer clouded, she remembered something Radon had spoke of long ago, about a vow he'd made supposedly with Mikola, so she sets off to discover the nature of this mysterious vow, and her search takes her to the Shadow Tower, which just so happens to be the very place where Sir Ansbach is investigating the disappearance of his own lord's remains. The wise old knight had discovered the answer to Freya's mystery while searching for answers of his own. He had learned that after Mog's untimely death, his corpse was taken straight to Mikola, who used the corpse to get to the Shadow Realm. But that was just step one. Mikola had also taken Mog's remains to the Shadow Realm with him with the intention of using it as a vessel of sorts for the soul of his promised consort, Radon, Freya's master. And according to Ansbach, Mikola doesn't seem to grasp the humiliation that this act is implying. Sir Ansbach then relays this information back to Freya after she found herself stumped in her search. He felt she had a right to know the truth of what was going on here with their respective lords, and naturally Freya takes this news a lot better than Ansbach did. She finds it to be an absolutely fitting fate for Radon, waging an unending warfare, which certainly doesn't sound like an age of compassion to me. I mean, how is Mikola going to reconcile that if he makes everybody in the world love each other? Who's going to be left for Radon to wage war against? Doesn't really seem like the two of them have thought very far ahead, does it? Anyway, Freya mentions that Jaren will probably be annoyed with this outcome since he spent like decades or ages trying to grant Radahn a worthy death, only for Miquella to swoop in and resurrect him. But since she has no issue with Miquella's goals, she tells the player to thank Ansbach for her and that it would be a great honor to face him in combat since she can tell which way the wind's blowing. I mean, she sees that a fight is in their future, and that meeting his blade in combat would be the highest level of honor for her. So she clearly highly respects Ansbach, which is really cool. I mean, everybody loves the guy. She gives us her shield as thanks, and the next time we see her, she fights alongside Leda at Anir Elim, which leads her proudly to her demise, never even getting a chance to see her resurrected lord. And it's a shame really, but she lived for fighting, so it's fitting that she went out this way. Her weapon of choice was really cool. It was a black steel greatsword with a golden mane, much like her Lord Radahn's twin blades, which makes sense as Freya wasn't just a normal Redmane knight. She was a part of his personal guard, a sworn shield to the legendary Starscourge himself. She was one of his most loyal knights, and it's not really that surprising that she was more than happy to meet her death in his name, or in this case in the name of his forced resurrection. But moving on. This guy's another one of my favorites. Sir Mor is a friendly knight / merchant and an ally of the Forager Brood, a band of pests who are extremely good at finding things. Foraging, if you will, hence the name. Mor acts as the main supplier to Leda's band. And due to his connections to the Brood, he's able to get his hands on many exotic items, even stuff like the elusive black syrup that the Allier was looking for. His unique armor is made of a substance called verdigris, which appears to be oxidized brass. The metal is said to be a gift from an outer god, extremely heavy but supple due to its corroded and rusted nature. If I'm getting theoretical, the corrosion could indicate that whatever god it came from was associated with brass, or specifically the corrosion of brass, as well as its oxidized green color, or alternatively the corrosion could be a sign that the specific outer god that it came from's time has passed. It could also point to a connection with the rock god, which I think would make sense given Mor's connection with the Forager Brood, who are in fact pests. I'll have more theories on all this in the future, but anyway, Mor is a nice dude. Unfortunately though, when Miquella's enchantment breaks, he almost loses himself. He begins to fall into a despair that only the player can bring him out of by telling him to put it all behind him. This works, but it also leads to him supporting Leda when she tries to cull you, forcing you to unfortunately kill Mor. The only alternative to this fate for Mor is to tell him to be sad forever when the rune breaks, but that results in him dying quite early, long before the confrontation at Anir Elim, which really just makes his story all the more tragic. Poor guy. Now we're on to the last member of the Band of Mike, Leda's band, if you will. And he's a man of few words and even fewer weapons.
I know Kung Fu.
I'm of course referring to Dryleaf Dane. So Dane is a member of the extremely strict Dryleaf sect of warrior monks, individuals who saw the eventual weakening and failure of order in the Fallen Leaves. This is where the order's name came from. The idea of wilting order is depicted by a dry leaf. Who would have thought? These ascetic monks practice hand-to-hand combat, and the learning of the arts was said to be the first step into becoming one with the dry leaf. Dane, on the other hand, developed his own style that was based around kicks and footwork by allowing a waterfall to beat down on him and throwing himself into its basin. Classic martial arts master stuff right there. Anyways, though, the Dryleaf sect dedicated themselves to holding a strict faith and to transfer it over to whatever world logic came next, in this case, Miquella's compassion, supposedly. And as I mentioned, Dane is an extremely skilled warrior. He even offers to train the player by way of a friendly duel, but in the end, all he is just Leda's most trusted henchman, and has to die along with her, never getting to see this presumptive new age that he had already completely dedicated his life to. Which, I mean, honestly, seems like exactly what it means to be a warrior monk. I'd say that Dane fully embodied his archetype. But that was the last member of Leda's band of undeterred Miquella supporters. What a fun bunch, but they were hardly the only new NPCs introduced in this DLC, so let's get on to a different group. So unsurprisingly, there aren't a whole lot of people that live on the Jagged Peak. But let's start with who's been there the longest, and that would be none other than Dragon Communion Priestess Florisax. A truly old being, she was once an ancient dragon like the others we've seen in the base game, but she assumed a mortal form to lead her cult. A cult that the Dragon Lord had specifically created because he saw the insatiable hunger in man. He saw in mankind the potential to destroy his greatest foe. So he sent Florisax down there, who assumed a human form to teach the humans in the ways of communion. There's a precedent for this type of thing, as it's sort of what dragons do when they ally themselves with humans. Something similar happened after Laendel's war with the ancient dragons ended in treaty. The dragon Landsax took on a human form to teach the Erdtree faithful the ways of dragon lightning. The red lightning was only taught to extremely worthy individuals like Vike or the Draconic Sentinels, or the dragon's servants, the Beastmen. So there is a history of ancient dragons taking on these human forms to serve as priestesses to humans, and presumably assume leadership roles amongst the cult. Alright, so just for some background, long ago a low-born but massive dragon named Bale attacked the Dragon Lord, and the two left each other grievously wounded. Placidusix lost 3 of his 5 heads, and Bale lost a leg, and his wings were torn to shit. This resulted in the Dragon Lord going into hiding beyond time to slumber, and Bale retreated back to Jagged Peak in the Shadow Realm, where he would go on to produce multitudes of his low-born offspring, these so-called lesser dragons that we see today with only 2 wings and a lack of lightning abilities. Now, on behalf of Placidusix, one of his disciples, in this case Florisax, took on a humanoid form to instruct the humans in the way of the Dragon Communion, forming a cult in the process. And this cult will be led by none other than the priestess Florisax. She managed to teach and convert a great many of individuals into the communion, and their influence of the cult spread far and wide, from the consecrated snowfield all the way down to Caelid. And the ultimate goal of the Dragon Communion cult was to eradicate Bale's offspring while also using them to power up to potentially become strong enough to slay Bale himself. But anyway, back to Florisax. As if there wasn't enough on this priestess's mind, she also hasn't slept since she assumed her role. See, every night she gives her slumber to the Dragon Lord in exchange for his blessing, which she then grants to potential challengers of the Dreaded One. Seems like a kinda unfair trade. However, if one is inclined, they can grant her a good night's sleep with Thialier's concoction. It did say that it was strong enough to put down even the most ancient of dragons. Though if she does this, she is effectively abandoned by the Dragon Lord and unable to receive his blessings. Pretty fucked up for Placidusix, in my opinion. And unsurprisingly, Florisax is pretty broken up over it. Even if you tell her it was your fault, I mean, she still blames herself. But she comes up with a way that she can preserve her honor, saying that the Tarnished could very well one day become a dragon, and since your goal is to become Elden Lord, you could effectively become a new Dragon Lord, especially considering that if you ate Bale's heart, there's a good chance that it's eventually going to consume you and possibly turn you into the second coming of the Dread. But yeah, after Bale's been slain, you can return to her and accept her into your service, and she assumes a new spirit form to serve her new lord in perpetuity, which preserves her honor and gives her a new purpose. And she's every bit as formidable as an ancient dragon, wielding her flowerstone gavel to call forth extremely cool red lightning, and also just having a really unique and intimidatingly scary appearance. Now, if you don't recruit her into your service, however, after you kill Bale, all that'll be left behind is her heart, which you can then use to transform into her. Pretty cool stuff. Now, speaking of transforming hearts, let's talk about the Ancient Dragon Man next. So first off, what a great name. This dude wields a really cool weapon, a great katana made from the sharpened gravel stones of fallen dragons. It's also got an amazing Ash of War. But the Ancient Dragon Man is essentially, or rather presumably, what one becomes after consuming a great many of dragon hearts and is able to resist turning into a magma worm. This particular Dragon Man was once the arbiter of the Dragon Pit. He used to be the deciding factor to determine if a warrior was ready and worthy to face the Dread. All they had to do was beat him in combat if they wished to proceed their journey up the Jagged Peak. Now, I almost didn't include this guy because he's not really an NPC, he's more of a boss, but he also invades, so, I figured I'd just throw him in for no real reason besides that I like his name. But now moving on to the true star of the Jagged Peak questline. Now, who else but the man himself, Aigon. This guy was iconic right out the gate for his voice and his enthusiasm, which is a bit surprising because when we meet him, he's just a deranged guy yelling and cursing Bale the Dread, but he becomes so much more than that as we begin our climb of the Jagged Peak. In many ways, he reminds me of like a warrior poet from Greek or Norse mythology. The way he speaks, the tragedy of his character, the dramatic turns of phrase, the booming voice, all of it. He feels like a figure straight out of myth, and his backstory is sweet, simple, and brutal. See, Aigon was originally a pitiful battlefield scavenger who managed to find purpose within the Dragon Communion. Unfortunately for him, this purpose ended up being fleeting, as he was broken and riddled with fear after an encounter with the Great Dread of Jagged Peak, who presumably took Aigon's legs.
Fucking lie there now.
So without the use of his lower half, he spent his days in agonizing pain, but still devoted his time to coming up with new dragon-killing inventions, and that's effectively when we meet him, in the middle of one of his bouts of pain. And again, if you played previous FromSoft games, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this is another Old Hunter Yamamura situation, but Aigon here, he's got a lot of fight left in him. So after we conquer the Dragon Pit and begin our ascent of the Jagged Peak, killing every one of these low-born dragons we come across, Aigon appears and asks us to take his finger so that we can summon his spirit to help us fight Bale. As he puts it, his body may be broken, but his soul is on the peak, and he wishes to face the dread one more time. Overall, he really adds to the atmosphere of the Jagged Peak, occasionally popping in after you kill a dragon to yell victory. It makes this whole questline and region really feel like something out of a really old fantasy novel, like something simple, where a guy is just on this brutal journey to go up a mountain and slay a really powerful monster or dragon. In this case, a lone warrior scales a mountain full of dragons to kill the biggest, baddest one of them all, and along the way they're guided by this veteran Drake Knight who had failed where you plan to succeed, and his ghost assists you, to redeem his own failings in life, and that maybe, just maybe, that he might finally be able to rest. Again, it's like a fantasy short story, but told in an interactive way through gaming. Aigon makes it feel authentic with his excellent dialogue, and he's really got a great voice. It's also nice that we got to fight alongside a fellow Dragon Communion warrior for once. But the best part about Aigon is that he's also a damn chef, an inventor, and a chef. He managed to discover a way to counterfeit dragon flesh to quench the hunger of Dragon Communion warriors who have been unable to get a dragon kill. He uses animal meat and mixes it in with the Caller blooms that sprout from fallen Drake Knights, and of course you get a pretty gruesome looking meal. But Aigon's awesome, man. His weapon of choice is a massive great bow, and he's a bit like Simon from Bloodborne in that regard. But yeah, he really makes the Jagged Peak feel alive. Anyway, though, moving on to our next little small group of NPCs, we're going to go on over to the Cathedral of Manus Metyr and its court of absolute weirdos. So we'll start with the obvious, Count Ymir, a legendary glintstone sorcerer who has an insight into the true nature of the world itself. He's basically the saint of sorcerers in the lands between, and he's been revered by the Carian royal family as well, judging by how they've immortalized him with their scholar statuettes that have this tendency to turn things upside down. This shouldn't be too surprising though, as he was known to be the instructor to the Carian queen Renala's sister, Princess R'hllana, but that was of course before the Count abandoned his own reverence for the moon, claiming that it was merely the closest of celestial bodies and nothing more. And thus he turned his attention to the great beyond, the great night sky, and the greater will. Sounds great, right? Ymir rejects the Two Fingers, the Erdtree, and Marika herself, but seems to have a soft spot for the Finger Creepers, who it turns out come from the same place as the Two Fingers, and not Rykard. And he treats these Finger Creepers as his own children. There's one that he refers to as the little boy and tells you not to step on it. It turns out he's also been trying to birth fingers of his own, but has so far been unsuccessful as they all die. I think some of his fondness for the Finger Creepers was adopted by the Carian royal family to some extent, which could explain the large population of them back at the Carian homestead. Anyway though, Ymir's quite helpful when we first meet him, as he's not used to hosting guests in a land as forsaken as this. He gives the Tarnished a map and a necklace full of holes, nudging them in the direction of enlightenment, but not forcing it on them. And after taking a trip to the bizarre finger ruins that happen to be infested with finger creepers and giant lampreys, he's a lot more forthcoming with his knowledge of the world and its nature. He offers up various lore tidbits on the Two Fingers, Marika, Mikola, their lineage, as well as the greater will and the great beyond as a whole, space. He very casually brings up the origin of humanity's existence, Stardust. He reminds me a bit of a much more refined version of Marwyn the Mage from A Dance with Dragons, with the profound truths of the world that he just casually drops on us, like world-shattering truths. Like how the Two Fingers don't actually have any means of communicating with the greater will like they claim to. Only their mother Meteor once received a faint sign from the greater will, but never again. He drops other stuff about how America's lineage is fundamentally flawed and a huge part of the problem that has been plaguing the lands between for ages. Even Mikola can't escape his own lineage and thus his corruption. It's no surprise that this guy, Ymir, is living in the Shadow Realm, as anywhere else in the Erdtree faithful would probably try to string him up for spreading these slanderous truths about their queen. We're going to go a lot deeper into Ymir and Meteor as well as the Fingers as a whole in a separate video, so I don't want to go too off topic here. But anyway, Ymir wants nothing more than to become a mother of fingers himself. He found that he cared for the finger creepers due to their mother's ignorance of them, and Ymir's robes can barely contain the writhing beneath them, so I imagine he keeps a bunch of young finger creepers underneath. I mean, we see firsthand his love of the finger creepers, cradling one like it's a baby, so you'd think he wouldn't have any love for Meteor because she sort of just abandoned all of her offspring. But after we kill her, he pretty much loses it and takes power from her corpse in an attempt to become her successor. According to Yelan, we have offended Ymir quite dearly by killing Meteor, which is confusing, right? It seemed like we were just doing what he wanted us to do. He said our fate was guided by the stars now, plus he gave us the maps and the necklace that got us to this point, so I really don't see how we betrayed him or offended him in any way. Perhaps becoming a mother of fingers made him see threats everywhere, but it seems by the Anna invasion under his throne that he actually doesn't want us to see what's going on in the basement. Also, if you show up at night, you may find the Count visiting a curious grave dedicated to Yuri, a finger creeper presumably that Ymir failed to birth whole, something he seems really saddened by. So perhaps taking power from Meteor's corpse finally allowed him to become a true mother of fingers like he always wanted. But just like Meteor, the Greater Will ignored him completely. He's definitely somebody we're going to be following up on in the future. Anyway, he wears a very unique hat. It's got this sort of circular hole right in the center of it that was said to represent the greater will in its lightless abyss. So it would seem that the greater will is in fact the void of space. It is the night sky. It's interesting to note that light and gold aren't of the greater will, if the greater will is just nothing but a bottomless abyss of space, a vacuum, if you will, with no light. But Ymir's weapon of choice was a unique short staff with a crystal ball at the end that was meant to be an imitation of the microcosm orb that Meteor once used to receive a sign from the greater will, but alas, Ymir's would not pick up any cosmic Wi-Fi signal from the great beyond, possibly indicating that the greater will has long abandoned the lands between. Or it could just be that Ymir's staff was just a crude imitation and not really capable of actually receiving any kind of signal from the great beyond or the endless night sky. Or conversely, it indicates that Marika's obscuring of this lands of shadow from the rest of the lands between has sort of blocked Meteor from actually being able to contact the greater will. And it certainly does look like there's a veil, if you will, draped over the skidoo tree that's covering the whole lands of shadow. And maybe, just maybe, Meteor's microcosm isn't strong enough to receive a signal through that veil. Obviously just speculation, but it's always fun to theorize. But let's move on to Yelan, the sharp-tongued bodyguard of Count Ymir. Yelan and her sister Anna were born in a cold, dark jail with no light whatsoever, where they were trained to become sword hands of the night. And they would become true masters of the dark and cold in the process, but the burden of the intensive training had left their hearts frail and pliant, allowing them to be, well, easily coerced into service. Additionally, they may have even been Nox or night folk due to their association with the night and dark, and this jail in question may have even been Bonnie Jail, as it appears we can find the remains of an unnamed sword hand of the night there, wrapped up and placed at a small guillotine. Maybe a few Nox children were discovered when these jails were being constructed. I mean, we know the Nox were forced to live underground, so it could be a possibility. Now, Ymir says that Yolan suffered a great tragedy, and this could refer to this nameless sword hand that we find at the Bonnie Jail, possibly another sister of theirs, or it could refer to Anna, who either willingly or unwillingly became a puppet so she could serve Ymir for eternity. I tend to think that she chose the puppet's life, as we do have a precedent for that sort of thing, examples of the Nox doing exactly that, like with the Night Sister and Sorceress puppets. But alternatively, Ymir could have turned Anna into a puppet without Yolan's knowledge and uses her as his last resort guardian for Meteor's resting grounds. What's even more curious about all of this is that Ymir says that Anna had a heart of gold. Now that could just mean that she was the nicer one and not as cold as Yolan, but it could also imply some sort of connection to gold with a capital G. Maybe the sisters were Newman, maybe they were spirited away shaman. Personally, I'm not so sure. They could just be regular humans who were raised in complete pitch black cold, or they could be Nox. Anyway, after Ymir and Meteor have met their ends, Yolan sinks into a despair much like Quillen and must be either given an Iris of Grace or an Iris of Occultation. The former turns her into Spirit Ash by blinding her with light, and the other sends her home to the darkness. It also gives us her really cool sword. Both options are of course valid, but if you go the Spirit Ash route, you can reunite her with her sister. It just requires a bit of footwork. You gotta leg it up to the shaman village and then off the cliffside behind it onto a tower known as Rabith's Rise that was once built by a spell machinist who had a way with his cannons. Here you find the puppet body of Anna. All you gotta do now is interact with it with the Spirit Ashes of Yolan in your possession. This reunites them and makes them a paired set of Spirit Ash. One puppet, one spirit, two sisters. And they've got some really cool equipment. They wore Nazgul-like armor. Yolan fights with a katana that's as black as the void, while Anna fights with a throwable Shadow Claws weapon that's also really fun to use. And both weapons are partially incorporeal due to their shadow-like nature. They're made of absolute darkness, so they can never be fully blocked. They're sort of like better versions of Dark Drift from Dark Souls 2 and 3. Now the next two NPCs we're going to be covering are sort of like fallen deities. You know, individuals of extreme importance to their respective followers, that type of thing. The first of which is the iconic Horn-Sent Grandam. This old Tanglehorn Empyrean hides away in an old storeroom at the settlement of Bellarat Tower. It's possible that Fire Knight Quillen is searching for her as he possesses the key to the storeroom, but alternatively he could have just imprisoned her. Granted, she doesn't seem like a prisoner to me, so who knows. You'll have to forgive her for the mess, as she can't see too good anymore on account of the Tanglehorns coming out of her eyes. Anyway, this old woman is an Empyrean with Tanglehorn straight out of antique times, which is appropriate as she's referred to as Grandam, which is itself an archaic old-timey word for grandmother. She's been at this damn tower for a long time, to the point where her son is now a watchful spirit that can be summoned via incantation. Nowadays, though, she just sings and cooks for the sculpted keepers of the tower and keeps a divine beast helmet enshrined in her little storage closet that she's managed to turn into a modest abode. And if you pretend to be a sculpted keeper, she can cook you up some scorpion stews, and if you manage to kill Mesmer, the quality of the stew goes up tenfold. You get that premium gourmet shit, made straight from the spider scorpions of the Shadow Realm. Now, hopefully the ones that don't have wings. A worthy treat. And naturally, as an elderly Horn-Sent, she hates Marika and her offspring. There's a good chance that old Grandam here was around to experience the betrayal and subsequent purges of her people firsthand. I like that she calls Marika a strumpet. Such a granny thing to say. But this woman is a survivor if there ever was one, and now all she wants is a good nap, which she can finally get if you kill Mesmer. A long-awaited rest for the Grandam. The other of these two NPCs is Saint Trina. The centerpiece of various mysteries before the DLC dropped, Saint Trina has long been an enigmatic figure both in the Lands Between and in the lore community of Elden Ring as a whole. Then the DLC comes out and we get to meet her face to face and have a nice little chat, something I certainly didn't expect. It appears as though Miquella both is and isn't Saint Trina. It's sort of like the Marika Radagon situation. Saint Trina is Miquella's other half, and when the unalloyed Empyrean set out in the Shadow Realm, he discarded, among other pieces of himself, his other half, Saint Trina. Now this was seen as him abandoning Trina and her many followers. The slumbering saint herself eventually sunk into the bottom of a great chasm of coffins and death, leaving a noticeable purple effect on its inhabitants, rendering them all into her sworn guardians. It was here that Saint Trina blossomed in a garden of deep purple, and the light purple mist that she was known for coalesced into an intoxicating deep purple cloud, changing the off-white lilies purple and causing them to produce a syrupy poison-like nectar that lulls the imbiber into a deep sleep. I imagine that it's from this that Moore was able to make the black syrup for Thialier. But anyway, Saint Trina slumbered down here eternally. Meanwhile, all manner of death was slowly seeping into the chasm as well, eventually turning into congealed putrescence, and a particularly large blob of this stuff imbibed some of Saint Trina's nectar, turning it into a Knight of Putrescence, Saint Trina's guardian, and one of the coolest bosses in the DLC. Now, Trina's main goal at this point is to have Miquella killed, knowing full well that his death would also equal hers as well, claiming that a caged divinity is beyond saving. Now, she's another one who will probably get her own video in the future, but suffice it to say, she eventually gets her wish, and when Saint Trina finally died, she left behind a purple non-poisonous blossom in quietude. It was said her death was as fleeting as her life. A sad end to a character that, from all the descriptions I've read, sounded pretty cool and mysterious, and had actual potential to ease people's suffering as opposed to just tricking them into thinking they're happy like Miquella does. Saint Trina was often referred to as Miquella's fate. Presumably this was who he was supposed to become, his destiny if you will, but instead he abandoned it so he could go try and play God, resurrecting his brother that he was secretly in love with, foolishly believing that forced compassion would solve everything. I mean, who's his promised consort supposed to wage an eternal war against if everyone loves each other? It doesn't make any sense. So Saint Trina is right, Miquella's gotta go. And so does his abomination of a consort. Is his resurrection of Radahn even capable of speaking? I mean, you'd think he would speak or at least talk back to Ansbach, but no, we get nothing. So I'm going to go ahead and say it looks like the resurrected Radahn is just fully controlled by Miquella via his various enchantments and bewitchings. But moving on to the next two miscellaneous NPCs. Now the only thing that these two have in common is that they're both knights in service to the opposition. Now the first of these two would be Messmer's Fire Knight Quillen.
Gods, what a stupid name.
Seriously though, what a stupid name. Quillen is a bowl-cut fanatical Fire Knight of Messmer with a really unhealthy obsession with Queen Marika, his lord's mother. Now if Radahn was a Godfrey fanboy, then Quillen here is most definitely a Messmer groupie. He even remade his sword into a spear that resembled the weapon of his liege and styled himself as the Second Impaler. This guy can be a pain in the ass early on, but once you learn the moves of his weapon, it's quite enjoyable when he shows up for another duel. It's also pretty hilarious how confident he is in all of his invasions compared to how he is when we see him in person at the Shadowkeep, lying on the ground quoting fucking DMX lyrics, asking Marika for a sign. We even get to decide what to do with him if we happen to have an Iris of Grace or an Iris of Occultation in our possession. The Eye of Grace grants him the fleeting salvation he's been begging for and turns him into Spirit Ash so he can wage war forever as our slave. And the Eye of Occultation sends him shuffling off to the void where he belongs, and we get his unique greatsword. Once again, this is a pretty tough decision, but both of the rewards are worth it. And both of the rewards are deserved by somebody like him. Quillen sort of had this overinflated sense of self-importance when he wasn't even really the most significant member of his little snake cult. He wasn't the Fire Sage Salza, the village burner, or the Death Mask Wigo, the necromancer. He was just a regular guy with a bowl cut. So I guess we gotta give him some credit. I mean, this guy does live for his crusade, and he followed his lord into a forsaken land to commit unspeakable atrocities against the heathens in Marika's name. I mean, fucking endlessly, to the point where I imagine none of them still want to be there doing this. I mean, we even see ghosts of Mesmer's Black Knights and soldiers praying for this perpetual campaign to end, and while Quillen is supposed to be a fire knight with an unshakable conscience akin to Mesmer's own, everybody's got their limits, and I suppose the least Marika could do is grant him some fleeting sense of grace in his time of need, but too bad she's currently indisposed and his prayers would never reach her ears. And much like the old God of War games, it's on us to grant him salvation or damnation. Or am I confusing that with that old Dante's Inferno game? I can't remember. Anyway, you get the gist. Anyway, moving on. The other of these two knights is Moonrithel of the Boreal Valley, a Carian enchanted knight that followed R'hllana into the Shadow Realm when she left with Mesmer, foregoing all of the privileges that a knight of Caria might have had back in the lands between. And as we know, these knights were few in number, and they had a very important job of safeguarding the Carian princesses. They were extremely talented fighters, and they all seem to have the word moon incorporated into their name. We've got Knight Captain Moongrim, who guards Rennala, and this individual Moonrithel, who guards R'hllana. This knight's pretty cool. She's a friend of the Troll Knights that served Caria and fought alongside them in battle, even wielding a modified version of one of their greatswords in combat, as well as that massive glintblade spell they're so fond of. She seems to be the only human enchanted knight in the Shadow Realm, which doesn't bother her none. She serves alongside at least one troll knight at Castle Ensis, and there happens to be one headless Belfry Carian troll guarding the lone Belfry Tower not far from R'hllana's keep. So it's clear that R'hllana had some degree of influence at the Carian court for this many of the loyal Carian retainers to follow her into the Shadow Realm. Definitely an interesting flavor character, for sure. Now the next four that I'm going to cover I was almost thinking of saving for a separate video, but there's not really all that much to them, so why shouldn't I fit them into this one? I'm of course referring to the bosses of the Nameless Mausoleums, who all happen to be spirit NPCs. The Nameless Mausoleums are dedicated to four very different but equally great warriors who either lost their names or their hearts in the Shadow Realm. Now, unlike some of the other mausoleums in the rest of the lands between, these ones don't get up and walk around, and instead of being guarded by headless knights, these places are protected by the spirit of one of the individuals that was buried there. The eastern one in the gravesite plain is, to my knowledge, the only one of these mausoleums to be guarded by gravebirds, these winged golems designed to watch over graves and burial sites. Basically, they were created to serve the deathbirds and assist in the death rites. But anyway, this mausoleum houses the Black Jail Knight. He hails from a place called the Solitary Black Jail, which is sort of a bit like a regular jail, only it's got a barbershop style atmosphere. And these knights are quite metal. They sacrifice their hearts for heightened battle capabilities, which we see on full display in their boss fight. They've also got a very nice suit of armor with an Alva-like helmet, or I guess Goblin Slayer if you're into that. And they've got a really nice looking sword that seems a bit reminiscent of Ludwig's Holy Sword from Bloodborne. And if that wasn't enough, they also carry a Slave Knight Gale style fully auto crossbow, the Guts sidearm if you will. And I think he keeps his loaded up with like perfumer bolts or something like that. He's no joke. This guy was basically the skill check in the DLC for me. I spent like over an hour fighting him with no fragments on like New Game 4 or 5 because I just wouldn't let myself proceed until I had his gear. He was a lot easier on my second playthrough though with a brand new character. Anyway, moving on to the Western Mausoleum, which is located on the Recluse River near Bonnie Village. This one houses a maniac swordswoman known only as Rakshasa, which itself was a title only achieved by subverting oneself through carnage and the bestial consumption of one's enemies. So basically, she's just a completely brutal, blood-mad individual. Her armor looks as though the madness contained within is about to finally break free with its tattered look. In appearance, though, she reminds me a little bit of Sir Elan or one of his knights or knight captains from Dark Souls 2, especially with that great katana of hers. Although what makes hers unique is that it looks like it's a giant rivers of blood, but from what I can tell it has zero connection to the Formless Mother, just a love of spilling and drinking blood. If I had to guess, I'd say that this warrior hailed from the East, a place known for its bloody civil wars and weapons that cause bleed buildup, so overall it might just be a cultural thing for her. According to real-life legends, the Rakshasa are a race of usually malevolent beings prominently featured in Hindu mythology. They're basically evil spirits. They reside on Earth, but they possess supernatural powers which they usually use for evil acts such as, among other things, eating humans. And I think that lines up a bit with the Rakshasa we see in the game. I suppose it could mean that the one we see in the game has been possessed by a Rakshasa due to them subverting themselves by causing carnage and bloodshed, and then proceeding to drink and consume that bloodshed. Anyway, moving on to the northern mausoleum, which is located in the Ra region, situated on a very high up mountaintop, and it turns out that Freya wasn't the only Redmane that made it to the Lands of Shadows, as this place was the burial site for a former Redmane knight whose name has been lost to the histories. He goes by Red Bear now after the great horned beast that he had hunted and skinned when he first arrived in the Lands of Shadow. It was said that after this bloody hunt that he wanted nothing more than to become a bear as he bathed in the righteous glory of his act. In addition to his bear hat, he's also got bare hands, Elden Ring's version of the beast claws. He made these from the bear he hunted in an effort to fully become the red bear that he had slain. I do have to wonder though if the whole reason he hunted the bear in the first place was because it too had a red mane and he knew he could make a very sick fit out of it, since he seems to have just thrown it on while it was still freshly skinned and bloody and didn't even bother curing it. I guess by that point he had already become bear and had no use for procedures like the curing of meats and hides. I think it's safe to say that he ate the rest of the bear, whatever he didn't use to make into an outfit or weapons, or at the absolute least he ate the bear's heart, as he's capable of pulling off the Red Bear's Roar, which was jokingly referred to as the Bear Communion incantation, which I think implies that consuming a part of the bear or its heart is required reading for learning a bear incantation. Why else would they call it communion? But that's enough about old Mark Davenport here. Let's move on to the Southern Mausoleum. Now this one is a sight. It's located on a crab-infested island off of the beautiful Cerulean coast. This final mausoleum houses a curved sword-wielding woman known only as the Dancer of Ranna, and true to her name, the Dancers of Ranna never stop dancing, as the end of the dance marks the end of one's passion. This sort of reminded me of the philosophy of the blind swordsman in blue. Just as still waters turn foul, stagnation leads to decay, so warriors must remain ever moving. This blind wanderer was granted a flowing sword by a fairy that was supposedly represented by a dancer in blue, and he used the blade to seal away an ancient rot god. So both the Dancer of Ranna and the blind swordsman both have an adherence to staying in motion at all costs, as well as curved sword usage and having an association with a specific color. The blue the swordsman wore was said to symbolize the brisk waters, and the Dancers of Ranna wear an impassioned red as a sign of their, passion. So there's a lot of similarities there. Anyway though, the Dancers of Ranna also employ hidden ornate bottles of perfumed oil to incorporate flashes of fire and sweet burning scents into their dance. It honestly sounds pretty cool. I also do have to wonder if Tanith was once a Dancer of Ranna, before she was quote-unquote seduced by Rykard to be his second and his consort. I mean, they seem to be the embodiment of passion, and Tanith is nothing if not passionate about her cause. Definitely something to think about. Anyway, the Dancers of Ranna were so completely dedicated to their craft that they forgot even their own names in the process, something I'm sure the sculpted keepers of Bellarat Tower could relate to. But I believe that was all the NPCs in the DLC. This video came from me wanting to talk about a lot of different parts of the new lore, so naturally I probably missed some things, but this should serve as a good overview on the NPCs of Shadow of the Erdtree as a whole, and I'll most certainly be talking about a number of these individuals in greater detail in more specific kind of videos. But it's been a while since I did a big video like this, and I plan to do a couple more, like one on the bosses from the DLC and one on the overall story, and then again, like I said, one's on individual characters and aspects of all this new lore. I got a lot of plans, but I think my next big one's gonna for sure be the Aldia video, and I know I keep saying I'm not gonna mention it till it's done, but it's all I can say is it's coming along nicely. It's a labor of love. But anyway, as always, I hope you guys found this video to be at least somewhat amusing, entertaining, or informative. And if you liked the video, please like it. If you disliked it, please dislike it. And if you like hearing me ramble on about the various lore topics of various video games, and in the future a little bit about movies and TV too, then please consider subscribing. We're at, I believe, 28k, so we're very close to 30k, which is, again, huge deal for a little channel like me. We might do another Madman holiday special, I'm not sure yet. And weekly rants, they're still going to be a thing. I'm just trying to work through all this DLC stuff and finish the audio video. Then we will have the weekly rants. It'll be basically like a podcast where I just rant about various things from either Elden Ring lore or maybe a movie or something that I don't want to put into an actual video, or maybe it could turn into an actual video, but just stuff I feel adept at ranting about. But anyway, without further ado, let's have our outro and then our world-famous segment, The Final Thoughts. But man, there's a lot of great characters in this DLC. I actually enjoyed basically all of them. And there's also a handful of unique named enemies too that I'll probably cover in a separate video. I didn't want to confuse things and mix them into this NPC video, but I really like that everybody has their own motivations and goals, and that, you know, not everything is what it seems. The guy dressed in black is actually the good guy, and the woman in white is actually the paranoid lunatic. There's a lot of cool stuff like that to be had in the DLC. I also really like the revelations about the fingers. And I know I said the Ymir video was going to be next, but this one, this video was way more ambitious than I thought it was, and it kind of took up a lot more time. The Ymir video is still coming. It's probably going to be a smaller video at least than this one, but it should be coming really soon. I've almost come to some solid conclusions regarding all that, a solid narrative at least, with alternatives. And I know in these final thoughts sections, I always kind of talk about how I want to do some videos on movies and TV shows, and I'm going to get to it. I know I should probably be doing it as opposed to talking about it, but I've just been rewatching so many of these classics, and I really want to talk about them. So yeah, I just need to put it on mic. But I think I've rambled enough for this section. It's going to be a shorter final thoughts than usual because I've been talking for like over an hour at this point. But as always, I hope everybody's doing well, and I will be seeing you guys very, very, very soon. Or I should say, you'll be hearing from me very, very soon. But yeah, until next time, be safe, and I'll see you.
I've come to a realization. There's ample evidence. Without kindly Miquella's influence, I'm quite mistrustful of others.
Have you come to your senses? Now there's no need for any hand-wringing. The way the world is, I'd say it's a wonder people don't lash out more often.